Good evening. Welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Dr. Anthony Smith, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Dayton and the Chair of the Program Committee of the American Catholic Historical Association. Tonight, we have our fourth and final webinar in our winter series of webinar events. And we're going to have an excellent evening because we have a wonderful and talented group of international experts addressing the topic of the opening of the Pius XII Archives and Holocaust research. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, the much anticipated opening of the Pius XII Archives occurred earlier last year. But then, of course, COVID hit, and it hit Italy particularly hard. So the archives had to close. It subsequently reopened over the summer. And tonight, our historians and scholars will share with us what they've learned from the opening and to help us think through some of the issues and questions and implications of the opening of the Pius Archives for Holocaust studies. Before we get started, let me just do a few pieces of housekeeping. First of all, if you're enjoying tonight's event, I've enjoyed the webinars we've had over the winter. I'd invite you to consider joining the American Catholic Historical Association. It is an organization of historians and scholars of Catholic studies. It's over 100 years old. We publish a scholarly journal, a quarterly, that publishes new scholarship in all facets of Catholic history. We host 2 conferences a year, a spring meeting, and also a major annual meeting in January. Our website is a great resource for Catholic studies, and we have a growing presence on social media. So please consider joining us. In addition, for those of you who are members, just a reminder that a member survey was sent out in our newsletter just recently, and also there should be a link to it in the chat section of down on the bottom of your screen. In addition, just a reminder of the deadlines for both the John Tracy Ellis Award and the John Gilmary Shea Book Award is May 15th. And then finally, I just want to briefly mention about our annual conference. This year, we will be meeting, our next conference will be meeting in person in New Orleans, January 6th through the 8th. And we're all very much excited about being able to gather again in person. I encourage you to consider submitting a proposal for a paper or a panel or a roundtable. All areas of the history of Catholicism and Catholic studies are welcomed, and we're particularly interested in the subjects of African-American Catholicism, race and Catholicism, Southern history and Catholicism. And I should also note that the deadline for submissions has been extended to March 23rd of this month. More information about the conference, as well as the submission portal for your submissions, can be found again at achahistory.org. And with that, I will turn the rest of the evening over to the panelists and to Dr. Heath Spencer. Enjoy.
All right, thank you very much, Tony. It's really great to be here. And as Tony noted, this webinar is inspired by the opening of multiple archives relating to the pontificate of Pius XII on March 2nd of last year. And although the pandemic has complicated the ability to carry out research in these archives, the work has already begun. And over the next several years, we're certain to see many new discoveries, new publications, and new occasions for soul searching. The panelists on this evening's webinar have all made important contributions to our understanding of the Catholic Church's role during the Holocaust, as well as related topics that include anti-Semitism, Jewish-Christian relations, and representations of the Holocaust in history and art. And in this evening's conversation, they'll be offering their insights regarding the Vatican's position of neutrality in the context of war and genocide, shifting moral criteria for what the papacy should be and should do, and questions about Pius XII, the Catholic Church, and the Holocaust that remain, in the words of one of our panelists, Robert Ventresca, unsettled or unsettling. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. Dr. Suzanne Brown-Fleming is Director of the International Academic Programs at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And she's the author of The Holocaust and Catholic Conscience, Cardinal Aloysius Munch and the Guilt Question in Germany, as well as a book on the International Tracing Service Archive and Holocaust research. And her current projects include a study of Pope Pius XII's relationship to Germany and its bishops. We also have with us Dr. Robert Anthony Ventresca. He's professor of history at King's University College at Western University in Canada, and is a member of the Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He is also the author of Soldier of Christ, The Life of Pope Pius XII, as well as several books and numerous articles on Italian fascism and democracy, immigration, and the internment of civilians. And I should also mention that, that both Suzanne and Robert appeared in Stephen Pressman's recent documentary film, Holy Silence. A third panelist is Dr. Claire Maligot, who is at the Ecole pratique des hautes études in Paris and the Institut d'études politiques in Strasbourg. And she's the author of numerous articles on Vatican II, Jewish-Christian relations, and Catholic conceptualizations of humanitarianism and human rights. And then finally, we have Dr. Beth A. Griech-Polelle. She is Associate Professor of History and serves as Kurt Meyer Chair of Holocaust Studies at Pacific Lutheran University, and is the author of a book called Bishop von Galen, German Catholicism and National Socialism, as well as the author or editor of several other books on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, representations of the Holocaust in history and the arts, and the Nuremberg war crimes trial. And my name is Heath Spencer. I'm in the Department of History at Seattle University. My own area of research is church politics in the German state of Thuringia during the Weimar and early Nazi eras. And along with Suzanne and Beth, I'm a member of the editorial board of Contemporary Church History Quarterly. So just a brief explanation of how we plan to proceed. Rather than traditional presentations of papers, we'd like to do this interview style. So I'll be asking questions of each of our panelists. And after I talk to Suzanne and Rob and Claire, Beth will offer some commentary and pose some questions to the panelists. I'll pose one or two additional questions to all of them, and then we'll open up the conversation to questions from all of you. So I'd like to begin by asking Suzanne some questions about her paper, Pope Pius XII, Vatican Neutrality and the Holocaust, Case Studies from the Newly Opened Vatican Archives. And Suzanne, in your paper, you begin by providing some historical context behind Pope Pius XII's official policy of neutrality or impartiality, as you describe it. And I'm wondering if you can tell us what that meant. What is this official policy of impartiality? And if you could tell us more about that historical context and continuities you see between Pius XII and his predecessors.
Sure. First, I need to say that the views represented here are my own. They're not those of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum or any other organization. And let me take a step back from your question for a moment to say, I didn't come to the study of Catholic Church history until quite late, sort of mid-PhD. And I didn't really have a lot of context and coursework myself on the history of the papacy and its political role versus its role as the Vicar of Christ on earth. That I was used to as a lifelong Catholic, but this other role, this role of temporal power and political force, that was new for me. So it's really been fascinating to, in the context of the Holocaust and genocide, as you said, to look at the history of the papacy and how these two roles, that as on the one hand, the vicar of Christ on earth versus the head of a city-state, it's been really interesting. And what I learned when I was looking into this a little bit for a paper I'm working on that'll be coming out soon, is actually when we say neutrality, or some scholars prefer impartiality, what that meant to the popes of the 19th century and early 20th century was to remain out of political disputes on one side or the other, a willingness to negotiate with, broker with, and make deals with all kinds of governments, be they democratic governments, be they totalitarian governments, or to play a role, if asked, as a peacemaker, as a neutral entity that could broker peace on both sides. And this was a tradition that actually I learned preparing for this paper was goes all the way back, perhaps even further, to the Napoleonic era, when the Napoleonic Wars were tearing apart Europe. And at that time, the church had quite a bit of, there were many papal states at the time. Even at that time, the Pope said, I'm going to not side with for or against Napoleon, and was critiqued for that. And this pattern goes all the way through till World War I, when Benedict XV made a similar decision. I'm going to try to work with both sides in order to broker peace, thinking this would garner him respect. But in fact, it ended up having an opposite effect, where he was really critiqued for not taking a strong position one way or the other. And it was fascinating because in reading about this buildup over the century prior to the Holocaust, so many of the kinds of critiques and arguments were familiar ones to me. Yeah.
Thank you. So one of the things that I see in your paper is that you're exploring the tension between this tradition of papal impartiality that you've just described, and the freedom, but also the responsibility of the papacy to exercise moral and spiritual power. And in your paper, you present several case studies that invite us to wrestle with that complexity and with those tensions. And the first case study is a really striking one. It involves a remarkable letter, most likely written by a German Catholic woman, a former communist named Maria Sevenich in 1945. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the contents of that letter and where it's positioned in this larger story and some of the conclusions that you draw from it.
Sure. I have to tell the story of finding the document because, in these COVID times, I was supposed to be there for opening week of in the Vatican archives, and that was not meant to be due to COVID, and I couldn't make it. And I was able to just briefly get there, not for a long enough period of time to make any conclusive findings, but I was there for a week in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, and it was my first time. I've used those papers because we hold a partial copy of the Pius XI materials at the Holocaust Museum, but I'd never been researching in Rome, and I was totally geeking out because between the Swiss guards and the incredibly beautiful space of the Vatican Apostolic Archive with beautiful paintings and marble statues, and sitting looking at papers with the person next to me looking at manuscripts that are hundreds of years old, it was an unbelievable experience. And so it was my second day in the Vatican Apostolic Archive this past fall, and I really didn't know where to begin, and I didn't have enough time to do much systematic work, which will change in 2021, I really hope. And I just kind of stuck with what I knew. I'd done a book on the papal nuncio in the post-war period, so I went to their Germania files, and there was this one folder, they're usually yellow, and there was a red one, and I said, ooh, it's red. What does this mean? So I I looked at that one, and on the front of the paper in Italian, it said "Against the Pope" in these bold Italian letters with an exclamation point and a 1945 written in red. So of course I'm like, I have to read this. And it was this letter in German. It was undated, and it did not have a signed author, and it was about 5 single-space typed pages. And it was this scathing critique of Pope Pius XII and of the German bishops that was, you could have read that letter in one of the very lively conferences on Pius XII today, where critics are listing their view of what the failures are. And this letter writer is saying them all in 1945 in this letter. She began in this letter in about 1930 with the original ban on Nazi Party membership that German bishops exercised in different dioceses, the reversal of that in 1933, anti-Semitism, racial policy, which doesn't mix with Catholic teaching, the build of the concentration camps, the war, the suffering of Polish Catholics, the lack of speaking out on, in her words, I'm not saying this, she said the Pope and Rome never uttered the word Nazi. He'd never broke off with Hitler and broke off their treaty. It was just 5 pages of this, same arguments you hear today, but eloquently written in 1945. So I found out about the letter writer actually through a good friend and excellent scholar of the Catholic Church named Mark Ruff, because I sent it to he and my other good friend Kevin Spicer to say, have you seen anything like this before? And is it out there? And I've not seen it. And Mark had actually seen a copy of it in the Archdiocese of Munich and Freising, just buried in a set of letters that were critical of the 1933 Concordat Agreement. And on the copy he saw, it said Sevenich, the last name of this woman. So from what Mark and I can gather, it's Maria Sevenich, who was born a German woman who converted to Catholicism living in France in the late 1930s. She went back to Germany. She was naturally hauled off to a camp. She spent at least the last 2 years of the war in prison and was almost murdered in some of the last minute murders of all prisoners in April 1945, and went on to become a CDU politician and a vocal critic of the papacy. So that's all we know about her. And I'd love to learn more, but for me, she put into this letter this dilemma between trying to be the moral head of a universal church of billions of Catholics versus being a politician. At one point she even, and I'm talking too much, so you can skip your third question, but at one point she makes this sarcastic comment about Pacelli, Pius XII, saying, well, boy, if he'd decided to speak more diplomatically if Jesus of Nazareth had decided to speak more diplomatically with the Pharisees, maybe, and maybe they wouldn't have killed him. In this very sarcastic, it was just, my mind was just blowing the whole time. But anyway,
Right.
So I'm taking up too much time, so you can you can skip whatever the next one was.
Well, thank you. It was a remarkable letter, and remarkable to see a complete translation of that in the paper, and so fascinating to see her critique this policy of impartiality,
Yeah.
and critique the church for failing to exercise its moral and spiritual power at numerous points during the Third Reich. So I did want to ask you another question, and I know there's really not enough time to go into all of the details, but your second main case study highlights Vatican officials' petitions after the war, at the conclusion of the war, petitions to the Allied and Soviet occupation authorities asking for clemency for German war criminals who had been condemned to death by military tribunals. And you contrast the considerable energy that Vatican officials put into defending these convicted war criminals with this policy of impartiality. And so I just wanted to hear a little bit from you about what led you to juxtapose those two different kinds of examples in the paper. What do you especially want us to notice when we look at those and think about them together?
I'm watching the time, so I don't take too much time on this. Well, it's the story of a blessing, actually. By that I mean a blessing or pardon at the hour of death, which is part of the Catholic last rites. That Pius XII granted in 1951 to a man named Oswald Pole. Oswald Pole was ran the entire concentration camp system, the slave labor system, the taking of all the material goods and bringing them back to Germany, all the way down from Jewish gold teeth. He was right there in the circles with Himmler and Hitler. And in 1951, while imprisoned, and he had converted to Catholicism after the war, he was going to be executed by the Allies. He asked for this last rite of a pardon at the hour of death, and he received it via telegram from Pius XII. This leaked into the press. It didn't look good. So that's not new. We knew that happened, but what was really fascinating was this internal correspondence where the nuncio writing to Montini, the future Pope Paul VI, Saint Pope Paul VI. Well, it's a typical Catholic tradition. It's not a political statement of any kind, and his conversion was so sincere. And it just leads one to think, okay, to answer your question, I'm going to do it in 60 seconds. So we have this policy of trying to remain neutral and not get involved in really deeply political intrigues unless they relate to defending the church or church property. And this was certainly political. And I don't know, it's hard to separate the person who sits in the pew every Sunday with my historical mind sometimes, but it just, I'm still wrestling with it. And 2 minutes, not bad.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much, Suzanne. Well, I'd like to turn our attention to Robert's paper on Catholics, the Holocaust, and the burden of history. And I see a number of points of connection between this paper and Suzanne's. But Rob, in the beginning of your paper, you tell a story about a public lecture that you gave, during which an audience member asked how one could reconcile the courage and conviction of comparatively few individual Catholic rescuers with the apparent silence, indifference, and complicity of the most powerful men in the church hierarchy. And your paper goes on to offer a multidimensional response to that question, beginning with the distinction between historical judgments and ethical judgments. And I'm wondering if you could start off by saying more about the relationship between historical analysis and moral evaluation when it comes to assessing Pius XII.
All right, thanks for the question, Heath. Just a bit of context or background on that talk, which was at the Jewish Community Center in Windsor, just across the border from Detroit. And I had been invited to talk about some aspect of the church and the Holocaust. And I was asked deliberately not to talk about Pius XII because there had been so much said about Pius XII and about the leadership of the church. And I readily obliged because, you know, at that point, the archives were not yet fully open. And there are all of these other, as my fellow panelists know, there's so many other related dimensions, given the complexity of the Catholic Church as an institution and as a community, that I agreed to speak about rescuers, right? And obviously the too few who took great risks, often at their own expense of their own lives, to help provide some form of refuge or safe passage to persecuted Jews. So that was the focus. I really didn't talk about the Pope at all, but at the end of the talk, during the Q&A, I was asked by, and as I recall it, I think she was the granddaughter of survivors, I was asked this question, pointed question, and the fact is, on the spot at the moment, I struggled to respond. Because I tried to give a kind of sort of my historical sort of analysis of it, but it was a question that nagged at me, and so there's a long drive home that night, and I describe it as a nagging question that's really driving the research, and I think that probably all my panelists will agree. I think it's that question that we keep coming back to again and again and again, which is, how do we make sense of how the most powerful man in the most powerful religious institution in the world at the time, how did he make the decisions that how did he judge the circumstances that he was presented with, and then how do we judge how he judged, right? I mean, I think the question of how you reconcile the power of the papacy and its limitations with what was obviously, I mean, as Suzanne alluded to before, the policy of impartiality, the policy of diplomatic caution, all of which has an explanation, right? There actually is a way of explaining why the Pope did what he did, or his nuncios did what they did. But we can, I don't think, ever escape the nagging question, which I think brings us into that moral and ethical realm, right? Was it the right thing to do, right? And so the dilemma that we all face, I think that we face it as scholars, but I think that, any student of history faces this, is grappling with historical evaluation, and then using that historical evaluation to make an ethical and moral claim, right? Those normative and moral claims, again, are also fraught with all kinds of complexity. And one of the things I think we have to be very careful about is I think, overgeneralizing it and making overly simplistic claims, either historical or moral ethical. I have to say, a lot of historians are not comfortable with the moral and ethical evaluation part, but I don't think we can avoid it. It just seems to me that we keep coming back to it again and again and again, and I think it's probably the single most compelling question. And I think it's an unsettled question, and I think it's an unsettling question, which, by the way, I've borrowed from our colleagues John Rothen and Carol Rittner. I think those are the questions that are driving us still. So I don't have an easy answer to it, but it's a question I don't think we can escape.
Okay, thank you. Well, with that question in mind, I'd love to move on to your assessment of the significance of the newly opened archives in terms of historical research on Catholic leadership in the context of war and genocide. And you and others have quoted Pope Francis, who said that the Church is not afraid of history. So my next question for you is, should it be?
Yeah, he's not the first Pope to say something along those lines, right? I mean, I think most of his predecessors, even in recent memory, and Pius XII himself, and Pius XI, they've all made allusions to this, this appreciation for, this recognition of the importance of historical research and scholarship and the search for truth and the love of truth and so forth. So I'll take him at his word when he says the Church is not afraid of history. I think the reality is that archives, including the Vatican archives, are of course an expression of institutional interests, institutional priorities, and to some extent they are expressions of power of any organization or any institution that organizes them. I think there's a reason why those archives weren't just sort of flung open over the past few decades. I mean, I think there's been an obvious need to, there's the technical concerns about codifying and systematizing things, but I think to some extent there has been a definite, if we're being really honest about this, I think that there's an awareness at official levels of the need to somewhat control the narrative. I don't want to go too far with that, and I don't want to suggest that, that what we're getting is not a full record. So I don't know whether the Church should be afraid of history. I don't think that the Church should be, and I say this as a historian who happens also to be a Catholic, right? Because I think the truth should be out, and and we deal with the realities of it. We know that a lot of harm comes to individuals, to communities, and to the Church itself when we preach transparency and accountability, but in fact we practice obstruction and secrecy. Right? That's just, I mean, that happens at so many different levels. But again, to his credit, the archives are open. They are indispensable archives. Suzanne and everyone knows we've been waiting a long, long time. There have been repeated promises. It always appeared that it was just around the corner, just around the corner, just around the corner. So of course there's tremendous anticipation. You can imagine then how crushed we all were when literally days within their opening everything closed. Of course, all of that put in perspective, given just how much suffering and loss was taking place and is taking place still around the world because of COVID. But these archives are indispensable because at the end of the day, they are the archives of the central government of the Catholic Church. So if you are interested in those fundamental questions about how the central authority of the Catholic Church acted in a time of crisis, in a time of genocide, I mean, Suzanne, for example, your insights into the internal dialogue, right? That's what we need to understand. We kind of know the end result. We know what the policy was, in a sense, right? Because it was stated at the time and it's been stated since. The question is why? Right? What did the Pope know? When did he know it? What did his advisors know? How did they process information? What set of assumptions did they bring to the way they were assessing the information that they were getting? Again, how did they judge, right? How did they decide to act or not to act? And then the question is, how do we judge that, again, historically and ethically? But they're indispensable archives. Now, there's a Catholic reality beyond the Vatican that we've got to be very careful. This is it's an exclusive Italian, male exclusive environment. There's a lot about the Catholic reality and Catholic responses to the Holocaust that cannot be captured at all in those archives. But they help us to understand, if you're thinking about the church as a system, right? They help us to understand the role of at least the center of that, the authoritative center of that, and its relationship then to this sort of the diffused communities that make up the reality of the Catholic Church then and now. So they're indispensable, but all of that is always taken, as all archives should be, with a grain of salt, and understand that at the end of the day, that the work of interpretation ultimately falls to scholars.
Thank you. So I see in your paper and in the comments that you've just made that you're striking a balance between the significance of the opening of the archives and the things that we're likely to discover, or the access that we'll have to answering certain kinds of questions, but also managing expectations of what we might find or might not find. And at one point in your paper, you state that it's unlikely that the new documents that are available now will lead to a seismic shift in our assessment of Pius XII and his role. Or you say there's not likely to be a smoking gun. We only have another minute or two, but I'd love to just hear you comment on that a little bit more. What will or will not change about our assessment of Pius XII in your estimation?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me about that, because I don't want to be misunderstood. I mean, I think these archives are really, really vital. What I worry about is sensationalism. What I worry about, and I think we're already seeing signs of it, is I think what happened with the previous generation of scholarship on Pius XII and public commentary on Pius XII, which almost felt like there was a sort of either this search for the condemnatory gotcha document, like, aha, we've got him now, or the search for some kind of exculpatory document, and that's a problem. Because first of all, I don't think the nature of these documents, these at the end of the day are state papers, if you want to think of it that way. These aren't the Pope's diaries as such, unless they may serve, something may serve us, one never knows. They're state papers. And so I think, again, I could be wrong, but on this particular question, if we're looking for that one thing that's going to suddenly, again, the aha moment, I think that's going to be, that's problematic. But I will say, because this is also what frustrates me, there is so much more for us to understand about the Vatican's role during the war, during the Holocaust, and in the post-war. We just tend to, and a lot of that documentation, by the way, has been readily available in other Vatican publications, right? Which by and large, we tend to ignore. Because the question again always comes back to the Pope's decision-making, especially in the moment of real intense mass violence and crisis, which is understandable. But I guess what I'm calling for there is an appreciation of, again, the limitations of any archival source, and a need to really broaden the focus. We can't separate the Vatican's response to the Holocaust from the Vatican's role in response to the war and to post-war and to manifold different issues that are all going on at the same time. So that's what I meant when I said that.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's actually an excellent segue into Claire's paper, since Claire has a lot to say about the early post-war era and connections with Vatican II, and also the kinds of sources that she's found in other archives and the kinds of questions that she's been able to engage. So Claire, in your paper, you challenge some conventional views, and one of those is the notion that Vatican II was what you refer to as an event-based rupture in the history of Jewish-Christian relations, a single watershed moment. And instead, you emphasize continuities stretching from the 1940s to the 1960s in terms of papal diplomacy and theology. And I wonder if you could explain how some of your research within or outside the Vatican archives led you to that conclusion.
Thank you for the question. I think that I was interested in contacts and not only in theology, because I thought that contacts can say a lot about how people interact with one another, and we really need them. And the fact that we can look at contacts makes us understand differently how Jews and Catholics interacted together, besides the fact that the Pope didn't speak as much as we wanted. So to me, looking to these contacts posterior to the war was a way to better understand the two crises that we have. That is the war period, and then the deputy controversy, where we have a lot of debates. But then looking back to these low-key contacts that were most of the time rather discreet or secret, because the Osservatore Romano doesn't present them, is a way to say that in the end, the mindsets that were framed during the war were still active, not only under Pius XII, but also at the beginning of the John the 23rd era, because also the Vatican personnel was the same. Sardini was there, Montini was there, so you also have in that debate the role of the future Pope, but also Dell'Acqua was there. And in that perspective, the renewal came from the Jewish side much more than from the Catholic side, because Jewish actors were quite different from the time of the war. And that was maybe one of the first points that I really wanted to make, that practices and mindsets have a long life, and so they keep on, even though we are looking at Vatican II. I really think that Vatican II is a turnabout, but we have to acknowledge that before being a triumph, it was a battle, and that battle was also within the mindsets of the people that were drafting the decree, and not only, you know, amongst the conservatives, because you could find some anti-Jewish narratives or just assessments in Father Stransky's remark when he was speaking about Zionists, so as to condemn a Jewish lobbying at Vatican II, using, you know, the support to the state of Israel as in a biased way, so as to condemn these kind of new diplomacy at the Vatican by Jewish organizations. So this internal struggle is everywhere all the time, also at Vatican II.
Thank you. And a moment ago, you were mentioning the very different approaches on the Catholic side as opposed to the Jewish side in those conversations, or what you referred to as the asymmetrical nature of Jewish-Christian relations during this period. And you contrast Jewish diplomatic efforts with Catholic theological approaches. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. And it strikes me that was a disconnect, that made it difficult for them to communicate, but somehow they were able to work through that. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more.
I wanted to get rid of dialogue, because dialogue is a word of the 60s, and it's not a word that is used in the 50s or in the 40s. Mm-hmm. So in order to get rid of that, I decided to use relations, because relations was more neutral. And it could embrace every shade of what relations are. That is, in both faith based groups, you always have theology and diplomacy. So, but it's maybe the degree of diplomacy, politics, and theology that change from one group to another. So to me, relations are a mix of activism, because it was the case of most of the grassroots movement that really promoted Jewish Christian and interfaith understanding. It is also diplomacy, it is theology, and it is personal contacts. The way that the Jewish groups that interacted with the Vatican looked at these contacts was to really insist on the diplomatical and political level, because of also an internal controversy, because rabbis didn't want to have something to do with the Catholic Church after the time of crisis and emergency, saying that in a way, interacting with the Vatican was already a way of acknowledging his moral authority. So what is interesting is how Jewish archives are putting forward the notion that the church should be only a political body, as much as Jews are interacting with the United Nations or the UNESCO and so on, and the way that in appeals to the Pope, they still refer to the notion of moral authority. And on the other side, you have the way that the Catholic Church agrees to receive these Jewish ambassadors or representatives, but at the same time will implicitly reject their demands or their questions because of a theological view that they will explain in other sources to themselves. So one of these references is, for instance, the way Tardini was speaking of the Jewish people as a deicide people when it came to not recognizing the state of Israel, as much as it came as it came when it to repel the Jewish document at Vatican II. And we can know that from the Council diaries as much as other sources that have been explored by also other historians.
Thank you. I have just one other question, or maybe two interrelated questions. But I was also fascinated by the way your research decenters Pius XII, and he does get a lot of attention. But you decenter Pius XII and many of the other individual personalities, and even go so far as to say that Rome wasn't the main scale or arena for interfaith relations. And I think that's a really important statement. And so I have two questions for you in response. The first, does this mean that the Pius War is an unnecessary distraction? And second, will the newly opened Pacellian archives be central to your own research, or do you expect that other archives will ultimately be more important for the work that you're doing?
I think that it's exactly what Robert has said, in the sense that it's because of the Pius War that we are framed in that question, in the sense that we need the Pius War, because the Pius War is what we can't understand Pius XII without the war. Pius XII without that war doesn't exist, because our mindsets and our questions directly derive from that. But what I can say is that the Pope is not the whole church. It's not even the whole Vatican circle. It's not the whole Vatican and Roman Curia. So what I want to do is maybe to look closer to how the Holy Office reacted to the thriving of Jewish Christian relations. What we have, for instance, is many different archives in diocesan archives in France, in Great Britain, in America, and in Germany, of an extended monitum from the Holy Office that condemned Jewish Christian relations on the same with the same words as it insisted to be cautious against ecumenism. And I think that if we go back to the central archives, we can now look at the same process of decision-making that we're now studying about the Pope and so on. So how the church system reacted to these peripheral tries to renew the notion of better understanding and dialogue and so on. So I mean, it's essential. These archives are essential. But maybe the fact that the archives have been closed for so long can be seen as a blessing in disguise, because it's because of this closing that we needed and we were forced to maybe think out of the box and looking in other sources. If things are easy, then you don't look to more complicated things. So in the end, I mean, we are lucky to be able to live this and to see that, and at the same time, it's a great joy because we are over prepared, and at the same time we know how to cross things and not to remain just fascinated by the Vatican archives and how beautiful Rome can be in the springtime without COVID.
All right, thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to hand things over to Beth, and she's going to offer some comments. And Beth, I know you have a couple questions that you'd like to pose to the other panelists as well.
Thank you, Heath, and thank you to all the panelists. I mean, the papers were just so fascinating to read and to listen to the kind of on-the-spot responses that you had to Heath's paper. I think in the interest of time, because I just kind of noticed that we're getting closer and closer to, having to go to watch the time more carefully so that we get audience questions in as well. I have comments. Most of them were kind of general things about Pius, and again, kind of putting him into that historical context. But I think maybe it would be better, and since we're having such a good conversation, if I can just I'm just going to throw some questions out, and then you can decide if you want to take a stab at answering it. I mean, it's not a quiz, so no one will fail, right? So, but basically, I would like to just pose a few questions, and then maybe Heath can also bring in things that have been appearing in the Q&A and fold those in as well. So. Again, for just general questions, what really also struck me in reading through the papers is that I think I would like you to talk even more about before Eugenio Pacelli was the Pope, right? Because we know that he had this very long, unique relationship of living in Germany for so many years. And so I think that for historians, in many cases, we tend to, we want to focus in on the war years, and obviously because he's now Pope and so forth, but in the 20s and the 30s, and particularly with the rise of the Nazis into power and with Hitler becoming the leader of Germany, Pacelli did still occupy an influential place in the church's hierarchy. And so I kind of would like to see, kind of our evaluation of Pacelli's choices expanded into the earlier years of Jewish discrimination and Jewish persecution, and not just thinking about, well, the war and he's the Pope. And so I just kind of wondered if anyone wants to take a stab at maybe giving examples of Pacelli's thoughts and responses to what Jews were already facing as far as systematic discrimination and persecution in Nazi Germany prior to the outbreak of war and prior to him becoming the Pope in March of 1939. So I'm going to leave it open. I'm not going to hand pick, who has to answer, but if anybody wants to maybe take a stab at that, that would be great.
I'll just say two things. That Rob has done this magnificent biography, so I'm sure he'll have a much more definitive answer. But in looking at, for me, some of the stories that stuck out when looking at the history of Eugenio Pacelli in Germany, he was the papal nuncio from 1917 to 1930, living in Munich and Berlin. And then from 1930 to 39 was Secretary of State in Rome, but still had this love for Germany, fluent in German. They say, and maybe the archives will bear this out or maybe not, that one of the influential moments for Pacelli was in when there was a brief communist uprising in Munich in, I think it's 1919, but if I have the year wrong, forgive me. And Pacelli was in the nunciature, and 2 or 3 of the communist revolutionaries come into the palace and threaten him. And the way he describes them subsequently, not just in one source, but in a couple of different sources, Frank Coppa found in his magnificent work, was we see the kind of typical anti-Jewish stereotypes. Now, it shouldn't surprise us. This is church teaching until 1965. But so I always think of him as someone who grew up in that church, and that mindset's there. And I can also say for the Kristallnacht, the moment of Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass in 1938, November 1938 in Germany, which some consider the start of the Holocaust, really, he had very detailed information about the pogrom. And at the time, Pius XI, Ratti was very sick, so Pacelli was sort of in charge. And he was not, he was asked to make some kind of very clear statement about Nazis, about what was happening to Jews. And already in November 1938, he declined and stuck with a message of universal love and charity. So he cast his die very early. That's my impression, but I'd love to hear from Rob, who has much better notions than I.
You put him on the spot. I didn't. Thank you.
Yeah,
It's a prize-winning biography
Yeah.
from this association.
That's right.
I was going to refer back to Suzanne's work on the Kristallnacht, right? Because I think you've studied that response very closely, and I was thinking, I think you put it perfectly. The die was cast. I mean, Beth, to your question, and I mean, I did write a lot about his time in Germany because it was so formative. You really see the outlines of his whole philosophy. And you know, at one point, in discussing with a good friend and colleague of mine, prospective titles for the biography, the idea of calling it the diplomat pope had to come up, because so much of Pacelli's action, so much of his worldview is framed by his training as a diplomat. So when it comes to his experience in Germany, I mean, a lot of things jump out. I think probably his overarching, I don't want to call it an obsession, but his overarching concern, drive was to establish the formal terms of the relationship between church and state, which is why so much effort was put into what became eventually, in 1933, the Reichskonkordat, by which point, of course, he had moved on and become Secretary of State. But that becomes the fundament, I think, for Pacelli, and really for all of papal diplomacy, that idea of setting the terms of the relationship between church and state was, in a sense, I'll say sacrosanct, and I don't mean that literally, but it really was a top priority, and everything gets viewed through the lens of that agreement. And it's not an alliance, right? It sets the terms and says, okay, you know, this is what's proper to us, this is what's proper to the state, and so much, and Beth, you know this also from your work, so much flows, even at the level of the local church, right? So much of what happens at the level of the local church flows from that kind of, it's called almost sort of a framework or structure. Yeah. What that meant, I think, for Pacelli is he seems so bent on avoiding anything like a diplomatic rupture and diplomatic confrontation. I think Suzanne's point, the die is cast. Even in the latter years of Ratti's pontificate, when tensions with Germany were beginning to increase because of, among other things, violations of the Concordat, or perceived violations of the Concordat, Pacelli, who recognized what was happening and not happy about what was happening, consistently, it's almost as if he's sort of steering the ship away from the iceberg, if I may use that analogy, constantly. Because he sees a disaster ahead if there were in fact some kind of frontal confrontation. Now, how do we measure that? Is that timidity? Was that a moral failure? Was it diplomatic wisdom? I mean, there again, we go from the historical evaluation to the moral judgment, right? I think also, just one last point to button it up, Beth, at the end of the day, the fate of Jews, the status of Jews in Germany was not a priority. right? I mean, Suzanne, I think we said your point about Kristallnacht, despite all of the evidence that was there and the clear opportunity that was there to finally say something and in an important decisive moment when things were turning violent, the pattern was there, right? Generic expressions, there's a kind of Vaticanese that we need to understand. So if you read between the lines, you know what he's getting at. He's condemning violence, he's condemning excessive nationalism, all of those things. He's saying all the right things, but it's blunted in its political effect, right? Right. He's so cautious, and he knows it's going to be blunted in its political effect. That's part of his calculus. Right. So how do we judge that?
Well, and it's always a good reminder as historians to think about trying to write history without letting ourselves know what the outcome of the events were and trying to walk in the shoes of the people living at that moment. And that's a very difficult thing to do, right? And I think as all of us have talked about, that it is very difficult to get into the moral judgments, and it is a heated issue. I wasn't sure if Claire wanted to respond to that particular question, or if you have thoughts about that, or if you would like me to just pose another question.
Maybe just say that the notion of universal charity is really something that keeps on going all the time. And the fact of just being able to isolate the Jewish question is something that really took time. Right. So really, again, we have continuity there.
Okay. All right. Do I have time for another question, Heath, before we, or I'm not sure how much time.
I think that would be fine. Questions are starting to appear in the Q&A.
Okay.
So maybe another 5 minutes.
Okay.
And we'll move into that mode.
All right. I must say that my students, if they're watching, are so impressed because they have probably never seen me be so quiet ever. Because usually it's like blah, 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 blah. So I'm trying to be very, very, mindful of not talking too much. I think in your papers, going beyond 1945 is critically important, right? Because it also can illuminate for us what lessons, what potential lessons could the Pope have learned, right? Since we kind of reckon with, was that he's silent? Was he not very forceful? I think in Rob's paper, he puts in bold letters, the Pope didn't issue publicly and persistently denunciations of Nazi actions. So there's the Christmas message, but it's buried in a 42-page address. And there are these moments, these glimmers of him making this known. And Rob's paper, I think, had the issue of the post-war issue of Jewish children who had been rescued by Catholics, and then Jewish organizations attempting to get custody of those children as a remnant, a survivor segment of the Jewish people. And the church was really fighting back. And Suzanne's work with Oswald Pohl and talking about, this papal blessing coming as this kind of final pardon before Pohl's execution. And then Claire's work going on into the 1960s and the build up to Vatican II. So I kind of would be interested in your thoughts about, are we hopeful that there's going to be evidence that might come out of these papal documents and the newly released archives that maybe gives us some insight that in the post-World War II environment, what has the Pope, what have Vatican officials learned about their choices that they made during the 1930s and the war years? So it's a very broad question, but I'm just going to kind of throw it out there and see, who wants to try to tackle that one.
I find that a very painful question. My first book was on the post-war period, because I have to say, in my naive head, in my early 30s, I thought, okay, in 1945, those who said they didn't know, they didn't see, or they were really confined to the crisis right within their own country or their own towns and villages, the Allies were so just blanketed Germany with newsreels and newspapers, and literally General Eisenhower had some German citizens walk through camps. By the fall of 1945, nobody could possibly be ignorant about exactly what had happened. And Maria Sevenich already said in fall 1945, the Pope didn't speak out about Jews specifically. He never said Nazi. So I guess in my naive head, when I first encountered this question 20 years ago, I thought, okay, once the fullness of the information is so clear, then there will be this reckoning and rejection of anti-Semitism, or at least a real like internal wrestling with, wow, 2,000 years of anti-Jewish teaching might have contributed to this, and wow, lots of Catholics joined the Nazi Party, and wow, some of them were shooters too on the Eastern Front. But that is not what happened in what I have seen in my work before these new archives, and I haven't done enough work in the new archives to see if the story changes. But what I saw in the Munch papers, talk about the importance of non-Rome held papers, the papal diplomat to Germany, from Rome to Germans to American Catholics, these canards about Jews were strong, and they were there, and they affected everyday decisions, and that did not change by the late 1950s.
Would other panelists like to respond as well?
Maybe just something about memory. I think that we really have to distinguish between the Jewish memory of the Holocaust, and we can believe what Hasia Diner has said about the fact that silence didn't exist within the Jewish community. Mm-hmm. But I really think that it's not the case for the Catholic Church and for Catholic people, in the sense that for Catholic people, you needed all the 40s and the 50s and even the beginning of the 60s to arrive to two dimensions. The first one is conceptualization, so the fact to understand what is happening and to really frame that into theological words, which, theology after Holocaust and after Auschwitz is something of the 70s, much more than something of the 50s. And the other dimension is the one of massification. So how do you get out of just one or two voices, such as Maritain and Mauriac and so on, to really a moral vision of the Holocaust as a problem also for the Catholic Church? And to come back to the late 40s, I really think that the reclaiming of Jewish orphans is the moment in which the discrepancy and the model of the wartime period is exploding, because Jewish organizations realize that they're facing what the law of baptism from the Catholic Church, and that if they want to discuss with the Catholic Church and to negotiate with it, they will have to find another way, because it doesn't work. So to me, peace is key. It's really the late 40s and this issue. And when you look at things like that, then you better understand the finally case thereafter, which is not just a setback in promoting dialogue, and dialogue that is better because you have Zedigsberg and so on. The finally case is really connected to that huge issue of the late 40s and the question of the Jewish children still hosted by Catholic institutions or families.
Thank you. Robert, did you want to tie this in?
Sure. Again, we want to get perhaps to some of so just really briefly, just to follow up. I think what both Claire and Suzanne have reminded us is just the enormity of the task before us, because there are so many levels and layers to the question. Mm-hmm. It may very well be on some questions, like, for example, the question of child survivors, that the Vatican was not a central actor. We don't really know. I think to Suzanne's point, we need to get into papers and sort of see exactly, we've got some fragments of things, but that's a story that perhaps really by and large is a story that takes place in France. It's perhaps more of a story at the local church or church state. the judicial angles there. I mean, which isn't to say that there isn't a role for the central government of the church, but it might be one of those questions where we have to change the focus or enter in a different level of analysis.
Right.
You know, like Suzanne, my first book was about post-war reconstruction in Italy and post-war Italian politics, which is really where I first was introduced to Pius XII. And he was very political, I have to say, in that era. But again, even at the level of reconstruction, I mean, there are levels and layers. Some of it is a very real material, financial, economic role. Some of it is very direct lobbying of governments or humanitarian interventions. And then there is, I mean, the world that Claire describes, which is so fascinating because again, it takes us outside of the strictures of the Vatican itself. And so there's just so much. You can see why the task is enormous. Right. And why it's going to take a long time, and a lot of us working together, I think, to really.
Yep. It's going to take an army of scholars,
really
right?
Take time too. It's going to take time, which is why you know, we should caution against quick rushes to judgment.
Well, we have a number of questions appearing in the Q&A at this point. One is, Pacelli was also Secretary of State during the Spanish Civil War. To what extent did that event, which included the murder of nearly 7,000 Catholic clergy, influence the neutrality of Pius XII during the war? And neutrality is in quotation marks in the question.
That one's for you, Beth.
Yeah. Darn it. I was hoping no one would remember that I wrote on that.
Oh, I remember.
Thanks. I thought it was just a commenter on the papers. Come on. Well, based on, again, I really did some research on the Spanish Civil War's impact on the German Catholic Church leadership, because I think that was a pivotal moment, 1936 to 1939, during the Spanish Civil War, because of the really outrageously violent acts against Catholic priests and nuns and lay people, that really at least focused the mind of the man I wrote my first book about, which was Bishop von Galen, later Cardinal von Galen, because in his mind, he accepted Nazi propaganda imagery that the Spanish Civil War was it was going to be the deciding moment. Would Western Christian civilization succeed, or would atheistic communism or Bolshevism succeed? And so, particularly in the minds of many of the high-ranking Catholic clergy, the Spanish Civil War did greatly influence their desire to work with, to have some kind of level of understanding and agreement, and hence the push for a Reichskonkordat, right? To have that level of understanding that would say, we are going to protect Catholic institutions as then a way of protecting Catholic access to the sacraments and to Catholic life. And what that, I think, led to was a kind of narrowing of the focus. And the focus for Catholic Church leaders like von Galen became, what is going to protect Catholic life and Catholic access to sacraments? And that was his worldview, and that was his domain. I am not an expert on Pius XII by any stretch of the imagination, but I would imagine that, of course, those very violent events in Spain did have some degree of influence regarding how he would respond to a crisis. And I think, as Rob pointed out earlier, Pacelli was schooled from a very young age to be a diplomat. And so I think his most natural inclination to every event is to respond using the mindset of a diplomat. And that's not necessarily what we want from him, right? We would probably like to go back to Pius XI, who was more of an emotional kind of person. But I think that the Spanish Civil War, I know that it had a definitive impact on the way that high-ranking bishops and cardinals in Germany reacted, and the way that they were open to having an agreement, an official agreement with the Nazi regime. And I think that that was deeply influenced by the Spanish Civil War and the level of violence and propaganda that surrounded it.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you for that question also. We have another question here. This one is directed to Rob, although I think others can feel free to join in. But it's how do you understand the focus on the relationship between church and state during the pontificate of Pius XII in terms of its influence on the Vatican II document Dignitatis Humanae?
That's a great question. It's one of the questions that I'm curious about. I mean, maybe beyond the scope of my research that may end up being more the prehistory of Vatican II. There's clearly a link. I want to be careful not to to exaggerate. I think the relationship, but it's very clear. And I'm thinking particularly of the work of American Catholics. I'm thinking also of John Courtney Murray, for example, who really starts to push the question along in those decades. Again, Claire probably will have to get in here because now we're into her domain. I will say that what I have discerned, and Courtney Murray actually talks about this in the case of Pius XII, is the beginnings of, he uses language like sort of there's an incremental change, an incremental evolution, if you will, that begins under Pius XII, that of course is taken on much greater force and direction under John the 23rd. But a lot of that work, of course, is taking place at other levels, right, among theologians and Catholic thinkers, to sort of move the state of the question along and to rethink the terms of the parameters of the relationship between the church and state. But that would mean changing the understanding of the nature of the church itself, right? And really kind of coming out of modern, pre-modern and modern understandings of the relationship between church and state, really sort of the notion almost of two states, right? Sort of two societies, and understanding the church's role differently from the way men of Pacelli's generation understood it. But Pacelli does begin to, and this is something that some human rights historians have noted, is that in the language Pacelli uses in some of those speeches that we don't pay much attention to, there is a language of human dignity. It's not quite human rights, although Sam Moyne has written about Pius XII's famous or infamous 1942 Christmas address as significant because of this acknowledgement of human rights. But there's a language there, an evolving language of human dignity. And the other thing that I've discerned in Pius XII's speeches that are not necessarily formally published as encyclicals and so forth, these are addresses that he made to various audiences, a lot of it's in Italian or in French, is a recognition of the need for a new, he doesn't quite call it a new international humanitarian law, but he's beginning to grapple with the idea of a law that's above the state, because he understands what, and the history shows him, what the state is capable of doing, whether that's Germany, whether it's the Soviet Union, whether it's the case of the Spanish Civil War that Beth alluded to. Again, it's very, very early days, but I've discerned very, very, again, I would describe it sort of as incremental change. I don't know if that answers the question at all, but it's certainly a question that's germinating in the back of my head.
Did others care to respond to that? Or are you happy to let Rob field it?
Maybe looking into the Italian historians, you have wonderful things from Silvia Scatena, who wrote something about Dignitatis Humanae, and she's explaining how church-state relations were essential to the post-war diplomacy of Pius XII, and also how we have to think beyond the individual, because many bishops still believed in the same principles that they learned together with Pius XII. So the fact that they are schooled in that framework of before the World War II is essential. Another thing is maybe to go on with the notion of international law that would be compatible with the Catholic Church is going back to the Thomistic approach of natural law and how it was opposed to the new wave of international law, and how, again, you have a continuity with Paul VI, and how much in that perspective, John the 23rd is maybe more like an exception between the two guys that work together also within the Secretary of State for a couple of years together.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe two more questions. I have one question that I've been somewhat selfishly saving towards the very end. But before I pose that, I'd like to choose another question out of the chat. This question has to do with Pius XII and the policy of impartiality. And the author of the question refers to a book by Owen Chadwick on Britain and the Vatican in World War II, and the claim that Pius XII was aware of and a participant in a plot to overthrow Hitler. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that book and that claim, and where that stands with respect to impartiality.
You want to try that one, Rob? Or...
I write about it briefly. And again, I know I'm trying to remember now, Suzanne, you'll help me with this. There was a book out recently about this subject.
Yes, Church of Spies.
Church of Spies, right? So just very briefly, my take on that is it's certainly the case that Pacelli, the Pope, I think, my understanding sent signals to the diplomatic, to the, let's say, the discussions, the negotiations that were going on around envisioning a future German leadership, right? Post-Nazi leadership, if you want. Again, discuss was something that both Beth and Suzanne were alluding to before. Part of Pacelli's worldview, or maybe it also his geopolitical worldview, was that you wanted a strong, unified Germany, right? In the heart of Europe, consistent with this vision of Christian civilization, right? And so the idea, again, I don't think the Pope was as involved as some have suggested. I don't see the evidence. The evidence that suggests the Pope is very closely involved in that is coming from second and third hand sources. Again, it's not a question that I have a particular expertise or comfort with. I will just say that I do think that it's clear, it shows that Pacelli understood, that the Nazi leadership was what we all understood it to be, that it was destructive and put at risk not only human lives, but also his own vision. But I would be very careful about sort of painting him again here as, sort of taking tremendous risk. My understanding is he enabled conversations at a diplomatic level. So I'm not sure if that answers anything, but.
Thank you.
I think I described in my book, it's been a few years now since I wrote it, but it was uncharacteristically, it wasn't that cautious in a sense. It was out of character, if you want to think of it that way, right? So it shows his potential and his ability to sort of, to take more decisive action or entertain policies that were, perhaps not so consistent with impartiality, if need be.
Thank you, Rob. Well, I have one more question, one final question that's inspired by Rob's paper, but it really is for any or all of you who choose to take it up. But I was struck by a statement that Rob made near the end of his paper, following his observations about white supremacists who marched in Charlottesville, Virginia in August 2017, some of them shouting anti-Semitic slogans. And Rob writes, I'll quote, "We have perhaps comforted ourselves too readily in the belief that educating students and the public about the history of the Holocaust would constitute a powerful antidote to ignorance and prejudice, that education above all else could actualize what the pioneers of Jewish-Christian dialogue after the Holocaust envisioned, namely the intellectual and emotional formation of young people in the humane and civic values essential for open and democratic societies," unquote. And my question, or questions in light of that statement, are, first, what changes ought to occur in Holocaust education to make it a more effective antidote to anti-Semitism and other forms of racism and xenophobia in our societies? And a second or related question is, what changes are already occurring in Holocaust education in response to the concerns that Rob has raised? So I would invite responses from any or all of you to that question.
I mean, maybe we are asking too much of Holocaust studies and Holocaust research. I think, research and education has a number of functions, but should we expect it to inoculate our sinful human nature and our every person's capability to do really, really bad things? I'm not sure we should even expect that in the first place. I think for me, really good Holocaust research and education is about careful, meticulous, sensitive, open-minded research, which is then presented in a way that is compelling for a broader audience so that we remember and honor the dead and the murdered. I feel sometimes like every really good Holocaust book is an honor to the victims. But no amount of education is ever going to change basic human nature. And it's interesting because, you know, that's what religion is supposed to help with. I don't think religion can do that either, but whatever one's faith is and whatever faith one practices or doesn't at all. I mean, what do we always hear in school and church? Love thy neighbor, promotion of human dignity. Those lessons are not necessarily going to come from education or the schoolroom. They come from the home. They come from your religious traditions. So I think we have to keep continuing with Holocaust research and education, make it accurate, make it sensitive, make it interesting for new audiences around the world who might not be coming from Europe. And that's our job. So yeah, those are my thoughts to kind of blurt out.
Thank you, Suzanne. Yeah.
What I can just add is that I'm depressed because in the end, you always have those groups, and the sadness of it is that you see them in the archives and then you see them for real in your real life. Mm. So this is a big issue that we have to deal with all the time. But I will finish with maybe American optimism, because in a way, these Jewish organizations that wanted to go and see the Pope to have a statement against anti-Semitism didn't believe in the Pope only. They also believe in democratic education, and contrary to what happened in Europe, they wanted to educate it in the classroom, which brings another kind of actor that is female teachers. And so you have a whole different approach to what Jewish-Christian dialogue or relations were, because it was not theologians anymore. It was sisters, nuns, and lay female teachers believing in this American dream of democracy under God and the way of doing everything at the same time. The first courses on the Holocaust that were taught by rabbis in Catholic seminaries and universities, democratic teaching and democratic education, and the fight for the civil rights. So this is an American history much more than a European one to me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Do I have a few minutes just to, I guess I posed the question more than I answered it. I still grapple with it. And I very much appreciate what Suzanne says, is expecting too much of Holocaust education, or any kind of education, I suppose, any kind of historical education. I guess the response to that might be, well, then what's it for? I mean, that's the thing we have to always, those of us who dedicate our lives to it, I guess, I have to constantly, especially when we see in many real places, history departments and humanities departments being shuttered, especially in North America. So I'm like Suzanne, I think it may be, and I remember the words of one of my mentors, Michael Maris, who said that there really are no lessons, that one has to be very careful about the idea of applying lessons. At the same time, I can't help but still be drawn to the idea of the transformative power of education. And it's interesting, Claire, you mentioned, the sisters. In my paper, I reflect a little bit upon my own personal experience. I grew up and I was in Catholic schools post-Vatican II. The transformation in the space of, so that would have been, I started in the mid-70s. The transformation was remarkable, so much so that, we never heard about I think about the way Catholics would have been educated in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s even, and the way that we were educated to think, for example, about the church's relationship to the Jewish people. There was a real revolution in teachings, and it did start to trickle down. Now, is it enough? I don't know. Probably not, and it's evident that even in the Catholic world, if it did trickle down, it didn't trickle down enough. But I don't know, I'm sort of struck, I don't have an answer to it, but I struggle with it. It's probably something I'll be struggling with for the rest of my career and the rest of my life. But sort of this, again, but I do think we have to be realistic, as Suzanne says. At the same time, you know, if there's something about Holocaust studies that matters to today, we have to constantly remember and we see an understanding of what it means when institutions collapse, what it means when the law, for example, is used as an instrument of exclusion, when courts are used to justify discriminatory behavior and exclusionary behavior, when religious organizations and religious dogma or doctrine or language is used to justify exclusion and violence. Those are powerful lessons and probably more relevant than ever. And I think I was thinking of that maybe when I wrote those words.
And I think to maybe pick up on Claire's American optimism, as a professor and specialist teaching about Holocaust, I think part of what sustains me is to try to expose students to the long history of anti-Semitic stereotypes and prejudice. And that ultimately the best I can hope for is that at some point when those students leave the classroom, if they hear someone using a slur, not just about Jews, but about any other persecuted or ostracized minority group, that they remember my class and they remember some of the lessons that I've tried to impart. And that's probably the best that we can do, right? Is just to hope that our passion, our enthusiasm, and our kind of quest to get into those archives and do that meticulous research, and yet somehow make that history compelling enough that an average person wants to read that book and learn from it, and that hopefully they do take some of these lessons and they catch themselves if they're about to fall into using a stereotype or prejudicial language. So I want to hold on to optimism if I can.
Right. Well, thank you. I'm grateful for all of your responses to that question. And I think it's time to draw this event to a close, but I'd like to thank all of the panelists for their contributions, and Beth for your wonderful comments and questions. Thank you to all of the participants who attended this evening's webinar. And at this point, I'll hand things back to Tony.
Heath.
We can't hear you.
Okay, now you can. Thank you, Heath. And I want to thank each of the panelists for a wonderful event. It's a great way to cap off our series. Each of your perspectives and insights have been really marvelous. And also collectively, what a great collegial, thoughtful, and stimulating conversations you've offered us tonight. I'm sure I don't speak for only myself when I say I'm looking forward to what you will find in the future in these archives, as well as what you will write and publish in regards to your research. So thanks to all of you individually and collectively. I should also just kind of highlight Professor Claire Maligot for a moment, because this webinar truly does span oceans. She is coming to us from Paris, where it's 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. She's probably very tired, but she's made time in her busy day and night to join us and to contribute. So thank you very much, Claire. Just let me end by saying that a couple of thank yous to my colleagues on the program committee, Tom Resnick and Catherine Osborne, who worked with me to plan these events. And I should also say, to give a shout out to a person nobody's seen, but Andy Metzger, who was responsible he's the tech man who's made all this so seamless and so smooth. So thank you all. Have a good night, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Good to see everyone.
See
Yeah.
you all. Thank you.
Good to
Thank
see
you so much.
Good night.
Night, Claire. Have a good sleep.